Imagine being told by the one person you trusted completely, the person wearing your ring, sleeping beside you, planning a future with you, that you were basically just practice. Not in a fight, not in a moment of cruelty she'd later apologize for, just casually, mid-dinner, like she was commenting on the weather outside. She says you're cute when you get like this, that real confidence doesn't get rattled by an ex, that you're not quite husband material yet, but don't worry, you'll get there. And then she smiles at you and takes another bite of her food. Now imagine you go completely silent, not because you're hurt, not because you're lost for words, but because somewhere behind your eyes, a door just closed, quietly, permanently, without a single sound. You finish your dinner, you rinse your plate, you go to bed at your normal time. And over the next 72 hours, while she goes about her life completely unbothered, still laughing, still texting, still wearing your ring, you begin dismantling everything, quietly, methodically, one careful step at a time. By the time she comes home on Thursday, the closet is empty, the bathroom counter is cleared, and the man she's been calling her mentor for the last 4 months has 6 boxes sitting in his entryway that he was not expecting. This is that story. Before I take you back to how all of this started, tell me the time and where you're watching from. I always love seeing how far these stories travel. Consider liking and subscribing, but only if this one earns it. Now let me walk you back a bit. My name is Camden. I'm 34 years old and I work as a regional logistics coordinator for a mid-sized freight company based out of Charlotte, North Carolina. My job is essentially making sure things arrive exactly where they are supposed to, exactly when they are supposed to. Schedules, routes, handoffs. I track the movement of things for a living. Looking back now, I probably should have applied those same professional instincts to my personal life a little sooner, but I'm getting ahead of myself. I met my fiancée Priya about 3 years ago at a mutual friend's housewarming. She was sharp, funny, and completely unintimidated by a room full of strangers, which I found magnetic. We dated for a year before I asked her to move in. 8 months after that, I proposed. The apartment was mine. I'd signed the lease 2 years before we met and renewed it twice since. She contributed to rent and utilities evenly, but the name on every legal document in that place was mine and mine alone. That detail mattered more than either of us realized at the time. Priya worked as a project coordinator at a mid-sized marketing firm downtown. Her office was the kind of place that had exposed brick walls and a kombucha tap in the kitchen, which I always thought was a lot of personality for a company that mostly designed promotional mailers. But she loved it there. She was good at her job and she knew it. About 4 months before that dinner, a name started appearing in our conversations with quiet regularity. Dominic. Her mentor, she said, a senior creative director at the firm who had apparently taken a professional interest in her career development. They grabbed lunch occasionally, sometimes coffee after work. He had connections. He was helping her grow. I didn't react dramatically to any of it. People have professional relationships. Mentors exist. I wasn't going to be the man who made his fiancée feel monitored for having a work friendship. But I noticed things. I'm a logistics coordinator. Noticing things is literally what I do. I noticed that Dominic's name came up like background music comes up, constantly, and just below the threshold where you'd think to comment on it. I noticed that she laughed differently when she talked about something he'd said. I noticed that twice, when she came home later than expected, the explanation involved him but arrived slightly faster than it should have, like it had been prepared in advance. I noticed all of it, and I said nothing. Then came that Tuesday dinner. We were eating at the kitchen table, nothing unusual. I had mentioned, quietly and without any accusation, that Dominic seemed to take up a lot of space in her week lately. I wasn't aggressive about it, I wasn't making accusations, I was just being honest about something that had started to bother me. She put her fork down, looked at me and smiled that patient, slightly pitying smile. She told me I was adorable when I got like this, that a man who truly was ready for marriage wouldn't feel rattled by a professional friendship, that I wasn't quite there yet, not really husband material, not in the way that mattered. She said being with me had been good for her though, good experience, said it warmly like she was complimenting a decent restaurant she probably wouldn't return to. Then she picked her fork back up. I sat across from her and said absolutely nothing. Not because I had nothing to say, but because I had already said enough. And so had she. I drove to work the next morning in complete silence. No music, no podcast, no phone call to a friend to vent about what happened the night before. Just the early morning highway, the glow of headlights ahead of me, and the kind of clarity that only arrives after something permanent has already been decided. I want to be honest about what I was feeling during that drive, because it wasn't rage. It wasn't the hot, shaking kind of hurt that makes people send regrettable text messages at midnight. It was something cooler than that. Something more like the feeling you get when a very long, complicated equation finally resolves into a clean, simple answer. The answer was, I was done. Not done arguing, not done trying, just done. The way a building is done when the last structural wall comes down. Quietly and with no possibility of reassembly. By the time I pulled into the parking garage at work, I had already started running through the logistics in my head, which, again, logistics coordinator. This is what I do. I organize the movement of things. I assess what belongs where. I reroute when the original destination no longer makes sense. Priya no longer made sense as a destination. So I started making a mental inventory during my lunch break, sitting alone in the break room with a cup of coffee and my phone face down on the table. I went through it methodically, the way I would assess any complex handoff at work. The lease situation, entirely in my name, had been since I signed it 2 years before Priya and I even met. She was on nothing, not the lease, not the utilities account, not the renter's insurance policy. She lived there the way someone lives in a hotel with very comfortable furniture and a toothbrush in the bathroom. Comfortably, yes, but not permanently, and not with any legal claim to the structure around her. That mattered enormously, and she had no idea. The car situation was simpler. We each had our own vehicles. Mine was mine, hers was hers. No overlap there, which actually made the logistics cleaner. Then there was the ring. I had purchased it about 6 months earlier from a small independent jeweler about 20 minutes from the apartment. Not a massive, showy diamond. I'm not a massive, showy person. But it was meaningful, and it was expensive enough that I was not prepared to simply absorb the cost out of pride. I pulled up the jeweler's website on my phone right there in the break room and quietly checked their return and exchange policy. The return window was listed as 90 days for unused items in original condition. I counted backward in my head. I was inside the window. Barely, but I was inside it. I set a reminder on my phone to call them before the end of the week. No drama, just a phone call. Before I tell you what else I found when I started paying closer attention, if this story is already hitting somewhere real for you, consider subscribing, but only if it earns that by the end. The next thing I did during that lunch break was open the Notes app on my phone. I had been the one managing the actual logistics of our wedding planning, which, if you know anything about wedding planning, means I was the one holding all the important information. Priya handled the aesthetic decisions, the color palette, the floral inspiration boards she'd saved on her phone, the general vision. I handled the vendors, the dates, the deposits, the confirmation numbers. I scrolled through the notes slowly. We had placed a small holding deposit on a venue, a renovated farmhouse property about 40 minutes outside the city that she had fallen in love with during a site visit 2 months ago. We had also had a preliminary conversation with a photographer and were close to signing a contract, but hadn't yet. There was a catering company we'd spoken to twice, but again, no signed contract, just preliminary numbers. The only real commitment was the venue deposit, small but real. I made a note to call the venue coordinator first thing in the morning. Then I finished my coffee, put my phone in my pocket, and went back to work. From the outside, I probably looked like a man having a perfectly ordinary Wednesday, reviewing freight schedules, answering emails, confirming delivery windows. Nobody in that office would have guessed that I was also quietly, calmly, and with complete emotional composure, planning the most organized exit of my adult life. Priya texted me around 3 that afternoon. Something about dinner, a recipe she wanted to try. A completely normal message from a woman who believed that the conversation from the night before had ended with her winning. I replied with a simple thumbs up emoji. Because the thing about a quiet decision is that it doesn't need an announcement. It just needs execution. And I was already executing. By Thursday evening, I had already made 2 phone calls I hadn't told Priya about. The first was to the venue coordinator at the farmhouse property. I explained that our plans had changed and we needed to release the date. She was professional and kind about it. She confirmed the holding deposit was non-refundable, which I had expected. I told her that was completely fine and thanked her for her time. The entire call lasted 6 minutes. The second call was to the jeweler. I explained that I needed to discuss a return. The man who answered remembered the purchase. Small stores have a way of remembering engagement ring customers, and he told me to come in at my convenience. He didn't ask many questions. I appreciated that more than he probably knew. Neither of those calls made me feel powerful or victorious. They just felt like the right administrative steps in the right order, like filing paperwork that should have been filed sooner. That Friday night, Priya and I went to dinner with my closest friend, a guy I've known since college named Barrett. Barrett and his wife Simone had suggested a new restaurant downtown, and we'd had the plan on the calendar for 2 weeks. Under normal circumstances, I would have been looking forward to it. Under current circumstances, I went because canceling would have raised questions I wasn't ready to answer yet. The four of us had a good table near the window. The food was excellent. Conversation flowed the way it does when you're with people you've known long enough to skip the small talk. Barrett and I caught up on work. Simone and Priya talked about a show they'd both been watching. For about an hour, it felt almost normal. Then Dominic came up. Priya was telling Simone about a campaign her team had been working on and mentioned that Dominic had completely restructured the creative direction last minute and that his instincts had been right. Simone asked who Dominic was. Priya smiled. My mentor at work. He's brilliant, honestly. The kind of person who just sees things differently. Barrett glanced at me across the table. Just a quick look, the kind that says, I'm clocking this, are you? I kept my expression neutral and took a sip of water. Then Priya, still talking to Simone, added something that she must not have thought through before it left her mouth. She said Dominic had told her recently that she was operating well below her potential, that she deserved a partner, professionally and personally, who matched where she was actually headed. The table went slightly quiet for exactly 1 second. Simone blinked. Barrett set down his fork. Priya seemed to realize about half a beat too late that the word personally landed differently than she intended in a sentence spoken directly across from her fiancé. She laughed quickly and said she obviously meant professionally, that Dominic was just very motivating to work with. I nodded slowly and smiled at her, the kind of smile that is technically a smile. Sounds like a great mentor, I said. Barrett looked at me again. This time the look said something different. It said, brother, what is actually happening right now? If you've ever sat across from someone and smiled while internally the last piece of a very important puzzle clicked into place, you already know exactly what that dinner felt like. Type I felt that in the comments if you've been in that seat before. The drive home was quiet. Priya talked about the food and how much she liked the restaurant and whether we should come back for their brunch menu. I agreed with everything she said and said very little else. When we got home, she went straight to the bathroom to take off her makeup, and I sat on the edge of the bed and stared at the floor for a moment. Professionally and personally, a mentor who thought she deserved a different partner, said directly, out loud, in front of 2 other people. And she had laughed it off not because it was untrue, but because she'd said it too soon in the wrong room and needed to walk it back before it created a conversation she wasn't ready to have. I had given her every benefit of the doubt for 4 months, every reasonable, generous, mature benefit of the doubt. And sitting on that bed, I realized I had just run completely out of it. Tomorrow, I was going to the jeweler. The jeweler's name was Mr. Ibarra. He was a quiet, careful man in his late 60s who ran his shop the way people used to run everything, with patience, attention, and zero unnecessary conversation. When I walked in Saturday morning and explained what I needed, he simply nodded, examined the ring under his loupe, confirmed the condition, and began processing the return without once asking me what went wrong. I respected that man enormously. The refund would take 3 to 5 business days to process back to my card. I signed the paperwork, shook his hand, and walked back out to my car. The ring that Priya wore every single day, the ring she twisted absently on her finger when she was thinking, the ring she held up to the light sometimes when she thought I wasn't watching, was now financially undone. She didn't know that yet. She was still wearing it. I sat in my car outside the jewelry shop for a moment and thought about that. There is something quietly surreal about knowing something that significant about someone's life while they go about their morning completely unaware. She was probably at the gym right now, or grabbing coffee, or texting Dominic about something she'd described to me later as purely professional. Which brought me to the thing I hadn't told you yet, the thing I found on Friday night after she fell asleep. I wasn't snooping. I want to be clear about that. Not because I need to defend myself, but because what I found didn't require any effort at all. It was just sitting there, in plain sight, the way things that have been hidden carelessly tend to eventually be. She had left her laptop open on the kitchen counter before bed. The screen had dimmed but not gone dark. I walked past it on my way to get a glass of water, and the brightness of the screen caught my eye. It was a message thread, a long one. The name at the top was Dominic. I stopped walking. I didn't read the whole thing. I didn't need to. The first 3 visible messages were enough, and I mean that in the most complete and final sense of the word enough. What I saw told me that Dominic was not a mentor in any professional sense of the word. The language was not professional. The tone was not professional, and the plans referenced in those messages, plans for the following weekend and described in a way that left absolutely no room for interpretation, were not professional. I stood in my kitchen in the dark and read those 3 messages exactly once. Then I walked to the bedroom, got back into bed, and stared at the ceiling until my breathing returned to normal. Here is what I did not do. I did not wake her up. I did not confront her. I did not take a photo of the screen or do anything dramatic or reactive, because the version of me that existed before that dinner table comment might have done all of those things, might have shaken her awake and demanded an explanation and spent the next 3 hours in a circular, exhausting argument that she would have found a way to reframe as her fault before sunrise. But that version of me had already made a quiet, permanent decision 3 days earlier. This new information didn't change the decision, it just confirmed it came with better timing than I realized. Moments like that are exactly why I pay attention now, because the truth doesn't always arrive with a warning. Sometimes it's just sitting on a kitchen counter, screen still glowing, waiting for someone to finally walk past. I closed her laptop gently on my way back to the bedroom. I didn't say a word. Sunday was calm. Priya spent most of it on the couch with her laptop, which I now understood carried a very different set of contents than she realized I knew about. She was cheerful, relaxed. At one point, she asked me if I wanted to look at floral arrangements for the wedding later that evening. She'd found a florist whose aesthetic she loved and wanted my opinion on the centerpiece options. I told her, sure, maybe after dinner. We could look at them together. She smiled and went back to her screen. I went to the kitchen to make coffee and stood at the counter for a moment with my back to her, looking out the window at the Sunday afternoon street below, and thought about how strange it is, how genuinely, almost philosophically strange it is, that 2 people can sit in the same apartment, share the same air, and be living in completely different realities at the exact same time. She was planning centerpieces. I was planning an exit. The calls I still needed to make were smaller than the ones I'd already handled, but they mattered. I had spoken to the venue coordinator the week before. The ring was already being processed. The photographer we'd met with once was easy. We hadn't signed anything, so a brief, polite email canceling our follow-up consultation was all that was required. I sent it from my work email on Sunday afternoon while Priya was in the shower. Subject line: canceling our consultation. Plans have changed. 4 words: clean, final. The catering company was even simpler. We'd had 2 phone conversations and exchanged some preliminary numbers, but nothing binding had been signed. I called on Monday morning from my car before walking into the office, told them our plans had changed, and thanked them for their time. The woman on the phone said she was sorry to hear it and wished me well. I thanked her and ended the call. By Monday afternoon, there was no wedding left, not in any logistical sense. No venue, no photographer, no catering, no ring. Just the floral inspiration board still saved on Priya's phone and the centerpiece options she wanted to show me after dinner on Sunday, which, for the record, we never actually got around to looking at. If you've ever made a quiet decision that completely changed the direction of your life, a decision you carried alone for days before anyone else knew, you already understand what that week felt like. That specific weight of knowing something enormous while the world around you keeps moving like nothing has shifted at all. That feeling is why people who have been through it recognize each other immediately. You can see it in the eyes, the particular kind of calm that isn't peace yet, but is the thing that comes just before peace arrives. If this is resonating somewhere real for you right now, you probably already know why stories like this one exist, and you probably already know what to do at the end of this one. The last thing I needed to handle before Thursday was the apartment itself. I had already confirmed with my building manager, a straightforward, no-nonsense woman named Miss Tran, who had managed the building for 11 years and had seen everything twice, that the lease renewal coming up in 6 weeks was mine alone to decide on. Priya was not listed as a tenant, had never been. Her name appeared nowhere on the lease documentation. Miss Tran confirmed this with one sentence: "The unit is yours, Camden, always has been." I thanked her. She didn't ask why I was confirming it. Like I said, 11 years. She'd seen everything twice. I spent Sunday evening going through the apartment room by room in my head, not physically yet, just mentally mapping it, cataloging what was mine and what was hers, the way I catalog freight at work. Item, origin, destination. Her things were not difficult to separate. We had never merged our belongings like some couples do, where after enough time you genuinely cannot remember who brought the blender. Our stuff had stayed relatively distinct. Her side of the closet, her bathroom shelf, her books stacked near the window, her kitchen tools in the cabinet by the stove. It would take one focused morning to box everything cleanly. I already knew which morning I was going to use. Thursday, her longest shift of the week, 12 hours, starting at 5 in the morning at the marketing firm's off-site production day across town. I set a quiet alarm in my phone, labeled simply, Thursday. Then I went to bed at my normal time next to the woman who had no idea that her life in this apartment was already scheduled for departure, and slept better than I had in months. Wednesday arrived the way the day before a major logistics operation always arrives, quietly, with a kind of focused stillness underneath everything. Priya was in a good mood at breakfast. She made eggs, which she rarely did on weekdays, and talked about a presentation her team had knocked out of the park the day before. Dominic, apparently, had told her it was the best work her department had produced all quarter. She said his name the way she always did, easily, naturally, worked right into the middle of a sentence the way you'd mention the weather or a podcast you were listening to. No hesitation, no awareness of any need for hesitation. I ate my eggs and nodded at the appropriate moments. Then she looked at me across the table with that expression I had come to recognize very well over the past few weeks, the slightly elevated, slightly amused look of a person who believes they have a comfortable advantage in a situation, and she said something that I will probably remember for the rest of my life. She said that Dominic had mentioned I seemed like a good, stable kind of guy, the dependable type. She laughed a little and said he told her that dependable was underrated and that she was lucky to have someone so steady in her corner. She said it warmly, like it was a compliment. Dependable, steady, stable. The man she had been exchanging those messages with, the man whose plans for the following weekend I had read on that glowing kitchen screen, had evaluated me from a distance and concluded that I was a reliable, non-threatening fixture in Priya's life, like a good appliance, solid, functional, unlikely to cause any trouble. I looked at her across the breakfast table and smiled genuinely for the first time all week. Not because it was funny, but because the irony was so dense and so perfectly timed that my only real options were to laugh or to tip my coffee cup in a small private toast to the universe. I went with a smile. "That's kind of him," I said. She nodded, satisfied, and carried her plate to the sink. She had absolutely no idea that in less than 18 hours, every item she owned in this apartment would be carefully packed, loaded, and delivered to the man who had so generously described me as dependable. I almost felt like I was living up to the compliment, honestly, because if there is one thing you can say about what I did over the following 24 hours, it is that I was extraordinarily, impeccably, almost poetically dependable about it. She grabbed her bag and her keys and kissed me on the cheek on her way out the door. "Don't work too hard," she said. "I won't," I told her. The door closed. I sat at the kitchen table for exactly 3 minutes. Then I stood up, walked to the hallway closet, and pulled out the first empty moving box. Type "I felt that" in the comments if you've ever smiled at someone knowing something they don't, something that was about to change everything. Because that Wednesday morning breakfast was the last normal moment in a story that was about to get very, very real. And before I show you exactly what happened when Priya walked through that front door on Thursday afternoon, I need to take you through the hours before she got there first, because that part matters. That part is everything. Priya left at 4:53 in the morning. I know the exact time because I was already awake. I had been awake since 4:15, lying still in the dark with my eyes open, running through the order of operations one final time in my head the way I would run through a complex freight handoff before execution day. Every step, every sequence, every potential snag identified and addressed in advance. There were no snags. I heard her move through the apartment quietly, the soft sounds of someone trying not to wake their partner, the bathroom, the closet, the rustle of her work bag by the front door, then the quiet click of the latch as she pulled the door shut behind her. I lay still for another 60 seconds. Then I got up, made a pot of coffee, and got to work. I had pulled 6 flat-pack moving boxes from my car the evening before and stored them in the hallway closet. Priya hadn't noticed them, which was not surprising. The hallway closet was my domain. She avoided it the way people avoid other people's filing systems, with complete, unbothered indifference. I started in the bedroom. Her side of the closet first. Dresses, blouses, and jackets, everything folded were hung carefully and placed into the first box with the kind of attention I would give to anything I was responsible for transporting without damage. I am not a careless person. I had no interest in being careless now. Whatever I thought of the situation, her belongings deserved to arrive at their destination in exactly the condition they left this apartment. Shoes next. She had a lot of them, organized on a rack near the bedroom door with a precision that honestly suggested she cared more about that rack than she cared about most conversations we'd had in the last 4 months. I packed them carefully, wrapped the delicate ones in the packing paper I'd thought to bring up from my car. Bathroom next. Her shelf was well stocked. Skincare products, makeup, the good hair dryer she'd bought herself last year. All of it went into a clearly labeled box. Nothing was thrown, nothing was shoved. Everything was packed the way I would want my own things packed if the situation were reversed. By 8:30, I had moved through the bedroom, bathroom, and living room. Her books from the shelf near the window, the small framed prints she'd hung in the hallway that were hers and not mine, the collection of candles she kept on the bathroom windowsill, the spare chargers from the kitchen drawer. I paused in the kitchen for a moment and refreshed my coffee. The apartment already looked noticeably different, lighter, like a room after a long window has finally been opened. By 10 o'clock, I had 5 boxes sealed and labeled by the front door and was finishing the last sweep of the living room, her throw blanket from the couch, the small succulent she kept on the bookshelf that she talked to occasionally, which I had always found endearing and now simply found practical to include. I packed the succulent carefully. It was not the plant's fault. The 6th box closed at 10:22. I stood in the middle of the living room and looked around. Everything remaining in the apartment was mine. Every piece of furniture, every kitchen item, every book on the remaining shelf. The space felt immediately recognizably like the apartment I had signed a lease on before any of this began. The next step required a drive. Dominic lived in a newer apartment complex about 12 minutes from our building, a detail I knew because Priya had mentioned meeting him near his place for lunch once, and because his address had appeared in that message thread on her laptop screen in a way that was not difficult to remember. I loaded all 6 boxes into my car, drove the 12 minutes, parked, and carried them up to his floor 2 at a time. When I knocked on his door, it took about 15 seconds before it opened. Dominic was tall, well-dressed even at 10:30 on a Thursday morning. He looked at me with the expression of a man who recognized a face without being able to immediately place it. Then his eyes moved to the stack of boxes in the hallway behind me. To his credit, he recovered quickly. He asked if he could help me. I introduced myself, told him my name, and explained that Priya was my fiancée, or had been as of earlier that week. I told her her belongings were in the hallway, and since she spent a meaningful amount of time at his location, it made logistical sense to deliver them here rather than leave them in an apartment she no longer had access to. He stared at me for a long moment. I want to tell you he looked guilty, but honestly he mostly just looked like a man who had dramatically underestimated what dependable actually meant. Within 20 minutes, all 6 boxes were inside his entryway. I thanked him for his time, walked back to my car, and drove home. The apartment was quiet when I returned. Peacefully, completely quiet. I made a fresh pot of coffee, sat down at the kitchen table, and waited. Priya had approximately 4 hours left in her shift. She came home at 3:11. I heard her car in the lot first, then her footsteps in the stairwell, then the sound of her key in the lock. I was sitting at the kitchen table with a glass of water and nothing in my hands. No phone, no book. Just sitting, the way you sit when you have already said everything that needs saying and are simply waiting for the conversation to arrive. The door opened. She came in talking, something about the production day running long and the catering at the offsite being terrible and how she was genuinely starving. She dropped her bag on the chair by the door out of habit. Then she stopped talking. It took about 4 seconds. Her bag had landed on the chair, but the coat she always draped over the back of that chair was gone. The shoes she kept by the door were gone. The stack of books near the window was gone. The throw blanket on the couch was gone. She turned and looked at me. "Did you reorganize something?" she asked. Her voice was still casual, still operating under the assumption that whatever she was noticing had a simple domestic explanation. "No," I said. "Nothing was reorganized." She walked toward the bedroom. I stayed at the table. 12 seconds later, she came back into the living room, moving considerably faster than she had left it. Her face had shifted, the casual afternoon expression completely replaced by something tighter and more alert. She asked where her things were. I told her they had been delivered. "Delivered where?" I gave her the address, Dominic's building, his floor, his door. The silence that followed lasted approximately 7 seconds, which does not sound like a long time until you are sitting inside it. Then the questions came, rapid, overlapping, getting louder as they arrived. What was I thinking? Was this some kind of jealous breakdown? Did I actually drive her belongings to her coworker's apartment like a crazy person? Who did I think I was? I let her finish. When she ran out of momentum, I explained it calmly. I told her that the engagement was over, that I had canceled the wedding plans earlier in the week, the venue, the photographer, the catering, all of it. I told her the ring had been returned to the jeweler and the refund was already processing, and I reminded her, as gently as I could, that the lease on this apartment had always been solely in my name. She stared at me. "This is because of Dominic," she said. "This is literally just jealousy." And here's the thing about that word, jealousy. She had been using it as a way to reframe my reasonable observations as personal weakness. Jealousy was her cleanup word, the word that made my discomfort into my flaw and her behavior into something I simply lacked the emotional maturity to handle. I had spent a lot of time being bothered by that word. I wasn't bothered by it anymore. I told her it wasn't jealousy. I told her that jealousy implies an irrational fear of losing something. What I had done was simply respond to information that had been made available to me, information that confirmed what I had already decided at the dinner table earlier that week. She went very still. "What information?" she asked. And here is where I made the only real decision of that entire week that required any genuine moral consideration. Because I could have told her exactly what I saw on that laptop screen. I could have described the messages in specific detail and watched her lose the ability to reframe any part of this as my overreaction. I could have removed every escape route she had in one sentence. Before I tell you what I actually said, if this story is landing somewhere real for you right now, stay with me. Because what happens in the next few minutes of that conversation is the part that changed something in me permanently. She was still looking at me, waiting. Her expression had moved past anger into something more fragile, the look of someone who has just realized they may have significantly miscalculated the stability of the ground they were standing on. "I saw enough," I said. 3 words. Her face told me that 3 words were sufficient. She tried 6 different angles. I counted. The first was denial. She said whatever I thought I saw on her laptop was taken completely out of context, that Dominic was a colleague, that the messages were professional, and that I had jumped to a conclusion based on a partial picture and blown up our entire relationship over a misunderstanding. I nodded. I didn't argue with that. The second angle was redirection. She said the real issue here was my insecurity, that I had always struggled with her having close friendships with other men, that this whole situation was the inevitable result of my inability to trust her, and that if I had just communicated better instead of going behind her back and dismantling everything, we could have addressed this like adults. I found this one genuinely impressive from a structural standpoint. The person who had been conducting a private relationship with another man while planning a wedding was now presenting my quiet, methodical response as the communication failure. That takes a specific kind of confidence, or a specific kind of practice, possibly both. I didn't argue with that one either. The third angle was minimization. She said the dinner table comment, the husband material comment, the good experience comment was obviously a joke, that I was a grown adult who should be able to distinguish between a moment of sarcasm between engaged people and a genuine assessment of the relationship. She said I had taken one sentence and used it as an excuse to do something I had probably already been wanting to do. That one was interesting because it was partially true. The comment had been the trigger, but the reason I pulled it was everything I had been watching accumulate quietly for months and everything I had seen on that laptop screen 2 nights ago. I told her that. She moved to angle 4. Now she wanted to talk about everything she had contributed to the relationship, the rent she had paid, the evenings she had cooked, the time she had shown up for me during stressful work weeks. She said walking away from all of that over a sarcastic comment and a misread conversation on her laptop was not just unfair, it was cruel. I let her finish. Then I told her I had already transferred back the prorated portion of rent she had paid for the remaining weeks of the month, that she hadn't lost a single dollar from this, and that the other contributions she mentioned, the cooking, the presents, the support, were things I was genuinely grateful for. They just didn't change what I knew or what I had decided. Angle 5 was the appeal to history. 3 years. 3 years of a shared life, inside jokes, hard moments, growth. She said you don't throw 3 years away over one bad week. She said I owed it to what we had built together to at least try. I sat with that one for a moment, because it deserved a moment. Then I told her that I wasn't throwing 3 years away. I was choosing not to add a fourth year onto a foundation that I now knew with complete certainty was not what I had believed it to be. There's a difference, a significant one. Angle 6 was the last one, and it was the quietest. She sat down on the edge of the couch, her former side, and looked at me with an expression I hadn't seen from her before. Something stripped of the confidence and the redirection and the strategic framing. Just something tired and exposed underneath all of it. She asked me if there was anything she could say that would change this. I thought about that question honestly, because she deserved an honest answer to it. I told her no. Not because I was angry, not because I wanted her to hurt, but because the decision had been made at the dinner table 4 days ago, and everything since then had only confirmed it. I believed her when she told me who she was. I just wished I had believed her a little sooner. She was quiet for a long moment. Then she picked up her work bag from the chair, slung it over her shoulder, and stood up. She looked around the apartment one more time, at the walls, the furniture, the space that no longer had any of her things in it, and then she looked at me. "You're going to regret this," she said. It came out softer than I expected, less like a threat and more like something she was telling herself. I stood up and walked to the front door. I opened it. "Dominic's building is 12 minutes from here," I said. "The traffic is light this time of day." She held my gaze for one long moment. Then she walked through the door. I closed it behind her. Not with anger, not with satisfaction, just with the quiet, definitive sound of something that needed to end, finally ending. The apartment was completely still. I went to the kitchen, made a cup of coffee, and sat back down at the table where all of this had started 4 days ago. Outside the window, the late afternoon light was doing that thing it does in early autumn, like golden and long and slightly melancholy, like the day itself understood the weight of the moment. I sat there for a while and didn't think about anything in particular. For the first time in longer than I could accurately remember, I felt like the air in the room actually belonged to me. The next 3 days were quiet in the way that only feels possible after something loud has finally stopped. I went back to work, reviewed freight schedules, answered emails, ate lunch alone in the break room the way I had the week before, except this time there was no mental inventory to run, no quiet plan to execute. Just lunch, just silence, just the uncomplicated feeling of a man who had handled something difficult and was now simply living on the other side of it. Priya called twice on Thursday evening. I let both calls go to voicemail. The messages were long and covered most of the same ground she had already walked through in the apartment. The misunderstanding, the overreaction, the 3 years. I listened to both of them once, completely, because she deserved that much. Then I set the phone down and didn't respond. Friday brought 2 text messages, Saturday brought 1. By Sunday, the messages had stopped entirely. I didn't block her number. That felt unnecessary. Sometimes silence communicates more than a blocked contact ever could, and she had received enough of my silence by now to understand exactly what it meant. Barrett called on Saturday afternoon. I told him the short version. He was quiet for a moment after I finished, and then he said something I appreciated more than he probably knew. He said he had seen it at the restaurant that Friday, the professionally and personally comment, and had spent the whole drive home afterward telling Simone something was wrong. He said he was sorry he hadn't said something sooner. I told him there was nothing he could have said that would have moved the timeline. The decision had already been made before that dinner. That night just confirmed it. He said, "Okay." Then he asked if I wanted to grab food this week. I said yes. That was the whole conversation. That is what a real friendship sounds like. No performance, no dramatic processing session, just a quiet check-in and a plan for dinner. I found it enormously restorative. By Monday morning, the apartment felt completely and naturally mine again. I had rearranged a few things over the weekend, moved a chair I'd always liked to where her bookshelf used to be, cleared the bathroom counter down to just what I actually used, opened the window in the bedroom that she always kept closed because she ran cold. Small things, but they mattered. I was making coffee on Monday morning, watching the early light come through that newly opened window when my phone buzzed on the counter. I assumed it was Barrett confirming dinner plans. It wasn't. The name on the screen stopped me mid-reach. It was Dominic. I stood very still for a moment, then I picked up the phone and read the message. It was longer than I expected, measured in tone. He said he owed me a conversation, that the situation Priya had brought to his door the previous Thursday had clarified a number of things for him that he wished he had understood sooner. He said he wasn't asking me to forgive anything or pretend the situation was something other than what it was. He said he had ended things with Priya over the weekend. Then he said something else. He said there was information he had come across, something Priya had apparently told him about me, about my finances, about my job, and about the apartment that he believed I had a right to know. Information that reframed certain things he had been told about our relationship from the very beginning. He said he would understand completely if I didn't want to hear it, but he thought I should have the choice. I set the phone down on the counter and looked out the window at the Monday morning street below. The coffee finished brewing behind me. Somewhere outside, a car pulled out of the lot and drove away, and the street went quiet again. I had two options sitting in front of me, and I knew it. I could leave the message unanswered, walk away from the entire situation with exactly the clean, composed exit I had already executed, no additional information, no new complications, no reopened doors, just the peaceful apartment, the open window, and a Tuesday dinner with Barrett to look forward to. Or I could find out what Priya had told him, what story she had constructed about me from the beginning, what version of Camden she had handed to another man while wearing my ring and planning my wedding and calling me adorable when I got jealous. Barrett had texted me once after I told him the story was over. Sometimes knowing everything is the closure. Sometimes it just reopens the wound. You'll know which one it is for you. I picked up the phone. My thumb hovered over the screen. The street outside was still quiet. The coffee was getting warm, and somewhere across the city, in an apartment 12 minutes away, a decision I hadn't planned to make was waiting on the other side of a reply button. I looked at the message one more time, and I started to type. Tell me which part of this story hit you the hardest, the dinner table, the laptop screen, the 6 boxes, or this moment right here. Drop it in the comments. I read every single one. And let me know where you're watching from. I always love seeing how far these stories reach. If you want more stories like this one, you already know what to do.